Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Why so serious?
Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for September 23rd, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, as we roll out into this conversation.
You gotta say that with a deeper voice, man. Roll
I don't
out.
have it. I don't have it. I wish that I did, but I was born with this voice. That isn't
Yeah, I can't
really
do it
good
either.
enough for radio. I don't have the face for TV. I guess podcasting was my only option.
That's why we're podcasters and not on TV, even though we have ironically added the video component to this now. So we are still on camera.
Yeah, this way we get to manage it ourselves, right? And
True.
I
True.
can be the voice of the show. I can be the face of the show, as you are as well. And it's our own thing. And I don't have to
Yeah. Well,
fall
proves we're not
into some
AI.
sort of conventional role.
Proves we're not Autobots.
Yeah, exactly. Because, and I guess maybe to be fair, not everyone can be Peter Cullen. There's only one Peter Cullen, so I
That's true.
I don't
That's
know.
true. Yeah.
But there are a lot of people that have that booming radio voice that's just perfect for it.
Mm-hmm.
That is just not me. I don't have a booming voice. My voice doesn't really project. And look, this is a show where we might get a little nerdy anyway, so I might as well start here if we want
Might as
to
well
talk
yeah.
a little nerdy in terms of like audio technicalities. Like my voice just doesn't project. Even if I get loud, it just doesn't carry. And I have to manipulate that on the back end a lot of the times when I'm editing.
That's why we're in a podcast format like this, where you can just follow that up with more words, so then you don't have to project. It's like you don't have the James Earl Jones gift, right? And very little people do, where they can just say a word and it's almost like it's like a bass guitar. It just rings and hums for almost minutes straight. It's very rare for someone to have that kind of gift.
Exactly. I do not, but I love talking about movies. If there's one thing I can do, I can project enthusiasm, and I feel like I am adequate.
We've done that
at
many
that.
times. Yeah, we've done that many times.
I could exhibit my love and my nerdy qualities for Transformers. I grew up on this franchise. The Transformers movie came out the year I was born. So I was maybe a little bit on the younger side as it was in its prime.
I had to think about that for a second, because many of our listeners may think, wait, JD was born in 2007?
Yeah, the animated film. Maybe I should clarify.
Yeah, let's clarify. The
pretty
Transformers, the movie, is what we're talking about.
Exactly. Transformers, the movie. And yeah, I mean, the animated show was in its prime when I was really young.
Sure.
Of course, it did carry on into the 90s. It then transformed, all pun intended, into Beast Wars at a certain point. I loved that show as well. But I grew up on those shows. I grew up loving the toys, reading the comics. I did it all for a long time. Well into my college days, I was still reading the comics. Like, I just love it.
So then you're the right person to be talking about Transformers 1, and I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on this, especially given the fact that your son Sam has pretty much latched on to a lot of the things that you also love, which means I'm guessing he is also a Transformers fan, and you saw this movie with him, and I cannot wait to hear that experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sam hasn't really fanned out with a lot of the same things I have, at least not exactly. And I do love that he's kind of developed his own identity separate from me.
Yeah.
He, of course, goes and will watch the Transformers films with me, Star Wars, Spider-Man, all of that.
Sure.
He'll watch football with me. He'll watch hockey, occasionally as well. But his favorites are different than mine. And there's, of course, all of the new age media that he's
Mhm.
engulfed in that I
Mhm.
am not. So there's that element
Does he
as
do
well.
like? Doesn't he get involved in like the Fortnite kind of stuff too? And
Yep, loves Fortnite,
Yeah.
loves playing VR,
okay,
which I will indulge in from time to time when he asks me to play with him. But
yeah, that's a foreign language to me at this point now.
yeah, and it mostly is for me too. I just like to play along, and he kicks my butt with whatever we're doing in VR.
If it makes him feel good, then you're doing a good job being a good dad.
Yeah. The only thing I can do is I can convincingly whoop him on College Football 25 on PlayStation.
Oh, okay,
That
okay.
I can still own him on. Everything else, he will kick
I
my
was
butt.
gonna say
all
like
day
what
long.
Madden game are you gonna bring up here that you can whoop
Yeah.
his butt in?
But that is to say, he likes Transformers, but it's not the same deep-rooted passion that I have for it.
Gotcha.
I feel like where we share that the most is with Spider-Man.
Gotcha. Oh,
We're
that's
both
cute. That's
kind
cute.
of deep-rooted fans in that regard. So,
Okay.
but yeah, I did take Sam to see this with me, and it was quite the experience. That is for sure.
That's great. That's great.
All right, with all of that laid out, shall we get into Transformers 1?
Yeah, let's do this. Weirdly excited to hear your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, it's also interesting too. I'll lay this out now before we get into our thoughts on the actual film itself. I don't think this was in my top 10 as far as most anticipated of the year, going back to that conversation back in January, but it was top of mind. I think I did at least note it in that conversation back in January as I'm interested in this. It's the first Transformers feature animated film in a really long time. And it was, it's a reboot of sorts. It's the first time we're going to experience Optimus Prime that isn't Peter Cullen.
Right.
I was curious what that was going to be. So this is a film I've been looking forward to all year. Well.
I think a lot of people, whether they're fans of Transformers in some way or not, had this lingering curiosity about this film, just given the trajectory of the Transformers films right now and how it's kind of in this weird state of flux in a way, especially after Bayformers. There were these efforts to kind of go back a little bit, explore stories beforehand with Bumblebee and Rise of the Beast and get a little creative that way. So it's almost as if Paramount is recognizing they need to start targeting a different demographic and a different audience here. And we'll talk about whether that was a wise choice or not. According to the box office numbers, questionable, maybe. But what that might not be reflective of the quality of the film, which I think it's pretty interesting given the quality of the film and the marketing that we saw. There was kind of a disconnect there, I feel like, and we'll talk about that.
Absolutely. And I also want to know as well in terms of anticipation, because again, I was always looking forward to this. I did circle this on the calendar back in January. However, I think what was manifested in terms of that GIF from which Quentin Tarantino movie was that Django Unchained with Leonardo DiCaprio, where he's like, okay, I was interested.
You
now
had my curiosity, but now you have my attention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a little bit of that because I was always going to be curious. It was always top of mind for me, as I noted. But then the early reactions to this was, oh, this is one of the best surprising films of the year.
Yeah,
like,
I heard that
people
a lot
that I
too.
know that are so alienated from this franchise was like blown away by how they responded to this. So that piqued my curiosity all the more. I was like, oh, okay, this might be more than just a me thing. So we'll talk about it, but I wanted to set the table there because I thought that was a fascinating way to go into this film. So.
Yeah, and I'm glad you set the table in that way. We've established pretty clearly that you do have a love for Transformers. You grew up with this. I don't share that love, not in the sense that I never disliked Transformers. The closest I ever came to really engaging with it was with Beast Wars. That was more my thing when I was a kid, and I only passively watched that. I was more interested in Hey Arnold and Rugrats, that kind of stuff when I was a kid.
All good stuff too.
So the fact that we have different levels of nostalgia when looking at this, I think is going to make this conversation very interesting.
I agree. Okay, with all of that said, let's jump into this. Transformers 1, directed by Josh Cooley. It stars Chris Hemsworth, Byron Tyree Henry, Scarlett Johansson, Keegan Mike and Key, Steve Buscemi, Lawrence Fishburne, John Hamm, and others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Transformers 1, it is the untold origin story of Optimus Prime and Megatron, better known as sworn enemies, but once were friends, bonded like brothers who changed the fate of Cybertron forever. All right.
That was
let's jump
epic.
into it.
That was epic. You're channeling a very different kind of energy that Peter Cullen would never even go for.
Yeah, look, I can do enthusiasm. That I can do.
There you go. Yeah. So if anything, Peter Cullen should be very envious of your ability to do plot synopses from IMDb.
Exactly. That's where I can beat him. Brendan, what did you think about Transformers 1?
So for about the first half, I will say, at least for the first third of this film, and keep in mind, I did just watch this today. I just got back from the theater maybe a few hours ago as we're recording this. So it's still very fresh in my mind. But for about the first third, maybe into the first half, I was thinking, yeah, I'm enjoying this. And then it got to the halfway point where I realized, hang on a sec, like I'm really invested in what's actually happening here. I was genuinely surprised by that reaction. And the fact that it concludes in a way that you more or less see coming, knowing the story of what this is. It's not really a surprise as far as how the dynamic between certain characters will ultimately shift by the end. But there's a surprising sadness to this movie that I did not expect, especially given the marketing and how it was basically targeting this as purely a kid's film. And it is mostly. But it's not a kid's film in the way that I thought this was going to be. I was expecting something in the vein of like, okay, a made-for-TV Nickelodeon or Disney Channel kind of thing, or a Cartoon Network kind of thing. And some of the humor does tap into that mentality, but there's a surprising sophistication to this movie that when I walked out, I thought, could Transformers 1 be in the conversation for being the best animated film of 2024? I actually, at least thus far, I think it's the best animated film of the year. I'm very surprised to say that. So I'm, and like I said earlier, I am not the target audience for this one. At the same time, I did feel a weird sense of nostalgia watching it because it reminded me of other properties I used to love as a kid. Maybe watching, do you remember Toonami on Cartoon Network at all?
Oh, man. Okay.
Yeah, like it kind of took
really
me back
here.
well, it kind of took me back to that mentality, but in a way that feels very earnest and sophisticated. And I genuinely found myself caring for this rather simple story. And I also thought about it in this sense, and maybe you'll talk about this too, given your experience seeing it with your son, Sam. But my wife, Maris, her brother's family has 3 kids, 2 girls and 1 boy. And the youngest boy, his name is Blazer. It's Blaze, but we call him Blazer. He's 4 years old, maybe going on 5. He loves Transformers, absolutely loves Transformers. I've seen him many times. He loves playing with Transformers with me. He loves this whole game. And he was so excited for this movie. I don't know if he's seen it yet. I'm not sure what his thoughts are, but watching this movie, I couldn't help but think of how he might feel about it and how his point of view is going to, like what his point of view is going to be, because I could see this for a 4-year-old being a formative experience for him. I could see this being one of those like let's say when we were 4 or 5 and we saw Toy Story for the first time, that kind of reaction. I can see little Blazer having a similar reaction to this, and it weirdly just made me appreciate the film more that it had that kind of earnestness to it. So I'm genuinely surprised by this one. I think it's really good.
Yeah, I really liked it a lot as well. Shocking, I know, but I really,
you not
really
so much. Me maybe so.
Yeah, for sure. But that is really the brilliance of the film. The Transformers nerd in me geeked out often throughout the film. There are a lot of callbacks here. It borrows much of the lore from the original Transformers. It harkens back to the G1 designs that many of us revere. All of that was enough to satisfy my nostalgic cravings. I mean, seeing Optimus at the end of this film with the Matrix of Leadership sent me to the same age as my son sitting next to me. Absolutely. I completely agree with what you're saying there. I became a kid again watching this film. But what's even more invigorating is that even outside of the nerdy Transformers stuff, as you're talking about, it's a really good movie about friendship, brotherhood, leadership, and how righteous indignation can spark bitterness and hatred. Yeah, I
Nice
know.
work.
Thank
Nice
you.
work.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
The puns are even better now that you've become a dad, not even just once but twice.
It's required by law that I have at least one per review.
Do you have to take a training course on puns when you become a dad? Is that just how it works?
That's exactly it. Yeah, they send you to a class, you come back, and you're fully prepared. Yeah.
I can't wait for that.
All joking aside, though, ultimately, all of that leads to a heartbreaking fallout between two closely bonded friends. You don't need to be a Transformers nerd like me to love this film. Brendan being a great example. Its depiction of friendship and heartache is so earnest and refreshing. And it's the backbone of this story. Even though we've seen Megatron and Optimus Prime many times over the years, they've never had the considerable amount of rich history and psychological depth as we see here. I certainly want to talk about that more as we go, but there are two clearly defined, vivid arcs that both of them experience, and it's all funneled through a timely lens of fascism and propaganda. The film's overarching ideas aren't new per se, but they're still complex in context, and they bring great nuance to the relationship between Megatron and Optimus Prime. And I gotta admit, I did not have that on my 2024 bingo card.
Yeah, I did not either. I did not either. And the way you're describing the film thematically makes it seem like it could be more artful than it actually is, but it's not. Those themes are there. And I like that they're there for a kid's film like this, but it's not so heavy that it would feel alienating towards children or its target audience, which I really do appreciate. It's not reinventing the wheel on some of those ideas that you're talking about, but I really like that this is perhaps the first theatrical Transformers film that we've gotten that takes its slogan, more than meets the eye, as a thematic idea as opposed to just a narrative idea. Just the general idea of overcoming what you feel like you're being suppressed by and how you feel like you're meant for something more. And that becomes a through line for both our main characters here in Orion Pax and D16, or Optimus Prime and Megatron respectively, before they're known to be those, upgraded versions of themselves. And what I like about it too is that even by the time we get to the end, for a film that's not even 2 hours long, you have a clearly defined explanation as to how and why these two characters experience their fallout. Like what their respective beliefs are and how they've come to such a disagreement with each other, especially with D16, whose vengeful shift midway through could almost feel very sudden, but it makes perfect sense since D16 is established as the one that looks upon his overlords with such pride and such respect that he ultimately is the one that feels as betrayed as he does. And you sense that. And it makes perfect sense as to why D16, voiced by Brian Tyree Henry, reacts the way that he does. He puts so much faith in his leaders, and that's what makes his downfall so expected. So like the film is doing the work. It's doing things in a very nuanced way that I did not expect. And maybe that's also because it has a filmmaker when Josh Cooley, who is actually, like a legit filmmaker. I didn't love Toy Story 4, but it felt like it was at least made by a real filmmaker at times. So there is someone with experience behind the animation, so to speak, that knows how to tell a story. So, and that's clearly evident on screen here.
Yeah, I completely agree. The characterization of Megatron and Prime here, or as you're noting, the names they're given at the beginning of this film, Orion Pax, which ultimately becomes Optimus Prime, and D16, who transforms into Megatron. Nice. The work, as you articulated there, as we see in that first third, the film absolutely does the work, and it is terrific. It's funny and refreshing to see how their roles are reversed in those early scenes where Orion Pax, again, Prime, is the troublemaker. He's
the rebellious one.
He's reckless. He likes to take risk. He still has a selfless quality to him, as we see when he saves Jazz, but he's a bit deviant, whereas D16 follows orders. He's apologetic and sucks up to his superiors. And most notably, as you're talking about there, he's extremely reverent to the Primes, to Sentinel, yes, but even more so to Megatronus Prime, a callback that's inspired because it's born out of irony and foreshadowing. It's not using nostalgia for nostalgic's sake. There's a dramatic and emotional purpose to it. I love how the film juxtaposes those two characters and what we'd expect for them based on conventional values. There's a lot of fun to be had there, and it vividly demonstrates just how close they are in their friendship, which is so important. So as the film unfolds and we eventually find out that they've been lied to and manipulated their whole lives, it makes sense that D16 would succumb to his indignation, something I think Brian Tyree Henry does a great job of tapping into in his vocal performance. And it fully realizes that irony of his reverence for the Primes, something that eventually paves the way forward for Optimus as he sheds his adolescent immaturity for wise and commanding leadership. And as a result, the showdown between the two of them at the end of the film isn't just another fight between these two iconic characters that we've seen 100 times before. This time there's weight to it. There's emotional stakes at play, and it is quietly devastating. The richness in the writing, the psychological depth, the calculated use of irony here is truly remarkable and not something I anticipated at all, but it is very welcomed.
There's a line uttered by a character, I won't say who, just for the sake of spoilers, that surprisingly hits pretty hard, and you know this narrative shift, this fallout is coming. But there's something about the way it's handled that it still hits hard, where one character says to another, "I'm done saving you." And I granted, I was alone in the theater, so there really wasn't anyone to engage in the film alongside with me to really kind of like have that visceral reaction with someone else. But even there, I was kind of like, whoa. I just had, I did not expect the film to tonally go there as opposed to just narratively going there. And I weirdly appreciate that for a film like this that is willing to do that. But it doesn't do it in a way that I think it's going to either scare children or alienate them or be a little bit too tough for them to comprehend. I think it's going to get children who are going to be excited for this movie nonetheless. It's going to get them talking about it. They're going to want to invest in what this story is, and they're going to want to have conversations with their parents about it. I think that's a smart thing for any kids movie to do, and I think this one does that very well.
No, I completely agree. I think what's interesting about that moment you're talking about, it is a little dire tonally, but I love how the film builds to that moment. And again, the duality between Prime and Megatron here, because that indignation that he experiences, you absolutely understand that character, why he makes those choices. And on the other end of that token, the aftermath of that choice, "I'm done saving you," leads to a sacrifice that births Optimus Prime and who we know him to be. So like those two things had to happen simultaneously. It is the culmination of the film in many ways. And I absolutely love the nuances, the depth there, because there's so much nuance that comes out with one line of dialogue and one action there. Everything that follows in terms of Prime and Megatron simultaneously, and how and what that moment says about both characters, it is incredibly full. The richness there is wonderful. And it's, again, something you perhaps anticipate because this is a prequel after all, and we know ultimately where this is going to crystallize. But in getting there and having a moment like that, that is so polished and redolent in its emotional stakes, I was kind of stunned. It is a great moment. And I love how, to your point, it's able to bring this depth, and it's something I emphasize here in the conversation because, again, I think it's what transcends beyond the nerdy Transformers stuff that I love about this film and even some of the comedy. But it is what I think it brings an appeal that a larger audience outside of Transformers will be able to gravitate towards.
It's the icing on the cake in what would otherwise be a fun and interesting movie nonetheless. Because if we take ourselves away from the depth of the film and what it's actually going for emotionally, which I think it very much succeeds, and it is ultimately the best thing about the film. Outside of that, it is a very fun movie still. I think as an action movie, as an animated movie, it's surprisingly inventive. The world building is actually really interesting at times. The depiction of Cybertron here is very interesting, which I really liked as well. There are interesting uses of animation as far as doing flashbacks and exposition dumps that made the exposition dumping less annoying to me. So there's a nice way to kind of I guess compensate for that by at least making it somewhat watchable. And the humor is hit or miss at times. At times it does target the younger demographic, so it almost feels like there could be that slight disconnect at times. That said, I did laugh a lot at Keegan-Michael Key as the early iteration of Bumblebee. And I think a lot of that's also the editing. Like there is some good editing around his humor in particular, especially when he discovers knife hands. I think some of
that's a great moment. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I'm going to cut these guys. Watch. It's the specific. I'm going to cut these guys. Watch, and then the two people just run away behind him. There are moments like that that still make it a very fun film. And don't make it too overly heavy for a film like this. So there's a nice balance there.
The Bumblebee aspect of this film is also an interesting subversion because that character, especially in recent years,
doesn't talk.
Almost 20 years at this point, he's a voiceless character. And in this film, he doesn't stop talking. In fact, one of the film's best jokes is that they had to bind and gag him because he wouldn't shut up, even though he was supposed to be unconscious.
Yeah, especially when he was unconscious.
It's such a great joke. I love that. And it's set up wonderfully earlier in the film when every other character is stoic, contemplative, trying to figure out what the next step is going to be. And he's just jabbing away, just talking the whole time. It's really great. And I absolutely love that as well. One of my favorite payoffs of the film as well is, and earlier in the film when they set up the whole, Badassatron, it is a little kiddish when they first set it up. It's like they're pandering to that younger audience as you're talking about, but the payoff at the end is really great. Like how they pay that off is
reminded me of Spaceship from the Lego movie. In a way.
Yes, it's a lot of that.
Similar
that's
kind
a
of
great reference.
Yeah,
and it works wonderfully here. So I do really like the comedic flavors of this film, and in particular with Bumblebee. Again, just how subversive it is to how we've known Bumblebee to be as a character, and all of that is in contrast to circle it back to again the depths of this film, the surprising nuance and themes that are here, because there is a significant amount of this film that is funneled through the prism of fascism, propaganda, classism. In a lot of ways, this film is a great reminder that well-explored themes in film doesn't make them vapid or tired, because we live in a world right now in an election year where these ideas are literally at stake. Propaganda, misinformation, it is everywhere.
Talked about every day.
One side of the political aisle is literally talking about and demonstrating fascism. Class warfare is as American as apple pie. So that's always timely. But again, it feels more hefty in 2024 with what's at stake. So while those things here aren't reinventing the wheel by any means, they are timely and still very resonant. And additionally, they're implemented very well into the context of the film to spark that righteous indignation in Megatron, as we mentioned earlier, as he feels deeply betrayed by what is essentially Cybertronian deities. And it gives birth to Optimus's conviction for freedom and justice. I, again, did not expect the film to go there, and it's not too heavy, but it is significant enough that it
Yeah.
gives this film a wonderful maturity that, again, I think is tantalizingly well used here, and it works as a great counterbalance to the film's humor.
Well,
and
yeah.
there is plenty of that. There's
There is
plenty of
plenty of
fun.
that,
There's
yeah.
plenty of Transformers-y nerd stuff here. Don't get me wrong. But that's what makes the balancing act of this film just incredibly surprising.
Well, I think that's what makes the movie so interesting and so surprising and ultimately satisfying is that it's not just trying to be a Transformers movie; it's actually trying to be a movie.
Yeah,
Which-
yeah, it
which
is.
I-
Capital
which
M
I-
movie.
Yeah, which I did not expect. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
its themes and what it's saying about fascism, as you're talking about, it's for those of us that have seen many movies, it is nothing new. But for let's say a 5 or 6 year old who wants to see this could
Yeah.
be their introduction to how movies
Yeah.
can tap into themes like that.
I don't know if Sam has experienced classism and propaganda in
Right,
the
right,
movies
but-
he's seen.
but
This
a
might be his first exposure to that.
But see, but a movie like this, it treats it in a way that it's not too heavy, that it'll allow children to maybe engage in that type of idea and maybe ask questions about that idea. Because these ideas and these themes, they have to start somewhere when it comes to learning about this, whether it be in history class, whether it be in art. There's always a starting point. There's a first time for everything. And I think Josh Cooley and his team are kind of aware of that here, they're not trying to make a history lesson or a lecture or anything like that, but they do want children to have a legit conversation on what these themes are, and ultimately that's what gives it its conviction. It's not here just for the sake of having something heavy to counterbalance the Transformers stuff. It does seem as though the storytellers, the writers, the performances here, they genuinely have a conviction in conveying these ideas. They feel connected to it, and they want this story to ring true.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think those things are frivolous or some sort of way to provide conflict. This film does act as a parable for, labor revolt, slave revolt.
Yeah, it is. It's
Like,
it's. I mean, that's the thing. And this could be said about any movie. Themes can be redundant just as they are emotionally compelling. Like they can be both.
Yeah.
They can absolutely be
Yeah.
both. And redundant
and-
doesn't
and-
necessarily need to be a bad thing.
And that's why I go back to, what does our world look like right now? This year's election has a lot at stake because fascism, propaganda, classism is a real thing that we are
talking
fighting
point.
for, that we are talking about in this election in 2024, not 1944. We're not reflecting on these things. It's not a History Channel program essay that we are talking about. These are real things happening this year. So films that recycle these themes, that's not an issue I will ever have a problem with, because it happens in real life all the time still.
Which is fair. Yeah.
We always go back to Roger Ebert. It's not what a film is about, it's how it's about it.
Yeah,
Sure, there's
absolutely.
tons and tons of films that have tackled, fascism, propaganda, classism. This is a well-versed topic in film.
Yeah.
But how the execution of that in this film, in a Transformers film, I think is very effective. I do think there's a richness to it. And again, how it leads, like those things working specifically, the mechanics of that, how it builds up Optimus, how it builds up Megatron, Orion Pax, and D16 respectively.
Yeah.
How D16 reveres these leaders. All of that bursts the progression of those characters, and ultimately where, again, pun intended, transform, how those two characters transform internally, how they transform emotionally. It's all funneled through that idea of leaders manipulating those beneath them and very actively creating a divide for their own gain, which ultimately comes out in this revolt that we see at the end of the film. And I think the film earns every bit of those ideas here.
It's so deep in that way that we haven't really talked much about the box office for this movie, and it wasn't that successful, sadly. And I think maybe part of that was the marketing disconnect, given the film that it actually
the marketing was not great for the film.
No. I mean, we talked about this. We were both going into it expecting one type of film, and actually got a movie out of it, which we're glad for. We love that kind of experience, but I do wonder if that played into the weaker opening numbers for it, or it could just be a few other factors. It could just be the fact that Beetlejuice is overperforming up the wazoo.
Yeah,
And
big
we've also
time,
seen
yeah.
this before. We've seen animated films with legs. We've seen movies like Elemental start off slow and actually develop
Great
an
point.
audience. And
Yeah.
this could be another one of those examples if families do respond to it in the same way, which I think they could. I hope that they do, because I think this one is willing to engage families and children and actually have conversations with them that are insightful. So I do hope that happens. And I also will say, I hope if it does become successful in some way, I hope there's no sequel. I don't know if I want to see this particular era continue, because I mean, you tell me this, you're the Transformers nerd. Is there any new place they can go with this iteration of these characters after the way that Transformers 1 concludes that could be interesting? Because I don't know. I feel like all that we really got here is everything to separate itself from everything else. And that's, at least that was my thought with it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's lots of interesting places they could go. I wouldn't mind to see a sequel. I know one thing the fandom has been craving, especially in a live action format, when we see something like the opening of, was it Transformers? Was it the fourth film? That opening sequence in Cybertron, when it's just the war and it's just the
I think that was
Autobots and
Bumblebee.
Was that Bumblebee?
I think that was Bumblebee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, either way, whichever film it was, that as an example, that's just one example, but
Sure.
I know many of the fans have been craving simply a Transformers exclusive film. And we've joked, we've talked about that before, that the human characters are often the least interesting part of the Bayformer film. Yeah. It wasn't until Bumblebee where that somewhat shifted a little bit, but
yeah.
Generally the Transformers are the most interesting part of the live action films. So here's an opportunity where they could do something new and different, where it's just the Transformers, it's just on Cybertron, and it's just about the war. That's something we really haven't seen much of, especially in recent years, that they could take advantage of, that they could give to the fans, that wouldn't require the resources of doing it in a quote unquote live action CGI realm, where that would obviously be expensive, and the films recently haven't performed to a point where that's warranted. If I was the lead at Paramount, I would also say no to that. Even as a nerdy Transformers fan myself, I would absolutely not greenlit that. There's no evidence to suggest, unless I go and get Michael Bay himself, unless he comes back to say, I will do that. And even then, I don't know if I would pull the trigger.
I don't know, but I weirdly would like to see Michael Bay come back to this franchise if he
do too.
wants to. I don't want to see the Michael Bay that was checked out of this
Not the
franchise
checked
and yet
out
still
version,
made The
yeah.
Last Night, right?
I
don't wanna see
agree.
that.
He was done. He only came back to that fifth film because, surprisingly, the fourth one made like $1 gajillion.
Despite it being like a 3-hour movie.
Yeah, weird that film did as well as it did, but that is to say, I do think there's room to play with. The tone of this film is obviously quite different than the live action, so it wouldn't be quite the same as those previous cravings and conversations, but similarly, I think you can emphasize the conflict, the war on Cybertron between these two characters, doing it in a way that is consistent with the tone of this film. I think there's plenty
There's
of
ways you can
room to
do that, yeah. It even despite it being sort of its own thing for its own audience, it still feels somewhat connected to the Bayformers films in a way, and I think a lot of that is due to Brian Tyler's score, which almost seems to be mirroring some of the the tonal movements of Steve Jablonsky without actually resurfacing very direct themes, but it kind of has a similar intensity to it, unless it's just the Transformers thing. It's just always been there.
Could be. Yeah.
But I did sense some comparisons there that allow it to almost exist in this middle ground where it's its own thing, but it's also not, which is kind of a hard thing to do. I have to give it credit for that.
Absolutely. And I love that the film wholly commits to this story and the dynamic, the relationship between Megatron and Optimus. That is the core of the film. It is the emotional stakes of the film, and it never really deviates from that at all, even though we get all of these references to other characters, or some of them we see on screen. Like I noted Jazz earlier. They don't take a beat to go, oh, this is Jazz. You guys remember him? He's just there and then he's gone.
They just call like characters by name, like Shockwave, for instance. They just happen to be there.
And there's a joke about Shockwave and Starscream and the High Guard, but they don't really take a moment to let the audience gasp in awe of, look at this callback. Like the characters that come, they're simply introduced. They're there for a specific reason.
It's more than an Easter egg, but less than a full-on plot point, which is a good middle ground.
Exactly. Like Ratchet, they reference him at one point. We never really see him on screen. Right. When they're doing the Iacon 5000 race and they show all of the names there on screen, tons of Easter eggs there. We see Silverbolt, Cliffjumper, Chromia, Jetstream, Wheeljack Hound. Those I can name off the cuff here.
I love when you go Transformers nerd on me.
But there's obviously a bunch more. And we, like the film doesn't take time to emphasize those characters though. So I say all of that to say there's so much here in terms of the world building that they introduced, but the film doesn't get bogged down in it. So there's room in sequels to bring in those characters, to expand on that lore more. In fact, I think one of the more interesting things about this film, and what I would say is my only criticism, but it circles back to what we're talking about here in terms of the film's focus, the conflict with the Quintessence is never resolved. And maybe, slight spoiler here, but at the end of the film, there is that fight between Prime and Megatron where Prime ultimately wins, doesn't kill, but wins.
Yeah.
And this is after Megatron had his moment there with Sentinel. And I guess the Quintessence just gave up now that Prime has the Matrix of Leadership. I don't know. Like Prime gives them a stern warning to stay away, and I guess they had just left. Like
it does resolve itself pretty quickly. I don't disagree with you there.
It's very weird, but I kind of love that the film never gets bogged down in the Quintessence and why they're there. It's about the relationship between Prime and Megatron, and the Quintessence just provide a mechanism for the fascism and propaganda to reveal itself.
They were pawns for that.
Exactly. And that's what's most important, not the conflict between them and the Cybertronians. So I can live with that just never being resolved. I can live with that being vague as it is here.
It's a criticism, but if it were fixed in some way, it could have potentially led to an even bigger criticism if it ended up detracting from the core, the emotional core of this film, being that friendship at play. And that's ultimately probably why it feels so unresolved, that particular thing that you're talking about. So it may have been the right kind of non-resolution for this film.
Yeah, I'm perfectly okay with it. It is weird. It ultimately is a criticism because they are such a... They don't have a lot of screen time, but they're a big mechanism in why Sentinel behaves the way he does.
They're an important piece in the chess match.
Leads to a major reveal. Absolutely. So that conflict just apparently it just dissipates once Prime comes back, I guess. There's no answer to it at all. But I love that because again it comes at the result of the film only caring or mostly caring in the way that it should have about Prime and Megatron and that dynamic.
Yeah, and it gets that right. It gets that right.
I agree. Like one of the more poignant, moving moments of the film, and I guess slight spoiler here again, but I won't go into too many details. But that moment, that flashback near the end of the film, after Optimus essentially tells Megatron he's not welcomed an Icon anymore, and you get that final flashback to when they first met, that I think is gutting.
It's pretty touching.
You feel a sense of tragic weight there. It's a little Cain and Abel in that regard. I would much rather have that than a scene where Prime confronts the Quintessence and tells them he's got to leave. You know what I mean? Like I would much rather have the flashback if I have to choose between the two.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it made the right call. So that's why I think if there's going to be a criticism there, if there's going to be an issue with the way it resolves itself, it chose the right avenue to leave incomplete, so it didn't sacrifice the other more important thing, which it could have potentially done. There's a lot to cover there, and it's not a long movie, but it's also not a short movie. So it has a lot of work to resolve by that final act, and I think it chooses the right avenues to do so.
I agree, and I think because the smart thing about the screenplay is that's really the only side plot of the film that would have needed to be resolved. Everything is pretty
it's surprisingly efficient. It's surprisingly smooth.
It's very
and efficient.
It's really just about Sentinel and this secret that he has that becomes exposed because Megatron and Prime find a clue that might lead them to the Matrix of Leadership. And so then everything is kind of centered around those three characters. And that's where all the conflict, at least the main conflict of this film, that's where it lies. And it doesn't need to deviate away from that. So it's all pretty containned.
And that's why that resolution you're talking about didn't really bother me, because I felt like it's a sacrifice it needed to make. Really, any criticism I have, really, the only criticisms I have here are things beyond the screenplay, because I do think it is a surprisingly tight and efficient form of storytelling. But really, my criticisms come down to, okay, some of the jokes don't always land. That's more of a subjective thing. But at the same time, you can kind of tell there was maybe in that first third, maybe a tug of war between, okay, we're making this a movie, but we're also targeting this to 4-year-olds. And there is kind of a push and pull at times. And I did not like Scarlett Johansson in this. She was the one vocal performance that I found too distracting. Whereas everyone else, I thought, actually blended into their respective characters surprisingly well. And that even when John Hamm shows up as Sentinel, I didn't even know it was him. I was thinking, I know that voice, but who is that? And that's usually the sign of a good vocal performance, when you don't find yourself thinking about that.
He disappears into the role very well.
And nearly everyone here does. Even Steve Buscemi, who has a very well-known voice.
He's pretty noticeable, though.
He's pretty noticeable, but he's at least playing with it a bit. He's twisting it a bit. He's adding a different quirk to it, which I appreciate.
He's very fun.
Yeah. ScarJo sounded a little bit bored to me. She's really the one link here that I thought was just taking me out of the movie a little bit.
You didn't like Black Widow fighting a Black Widow? That irony didn't land with you?
I like the idea of the irony, but when she started talking, I was like, oh, okay, well, that's Scarlett Johansson, not Black Widow.
Yeah, that's fair. I didn't mind it as much. It's one of my least favorite performances of the film, but I don't know if I could go as far as to say that she's checked out. I don't know if that's the case, but it's like some of those early scenes, I do think she's playful, and
I think she's okay there.
Brings
maybe it's
an
more
energy
so
to the character.
Maybe it's more so the integration of her rhythms with the action that maybe doesn't work, and maybe it could be that. But I'm also a bit biased because I think she gave one of the greatest vocal performances of all time, and Spike Jonze is her, so I just automatically assume when she does a vocal performance like this, the bar is very high. So if it doesn't quite hit that, I'm going to be disappointed, sadly.
And it's very fair. It's interesting you say that, because you can also look back at her vocal performance in the Jungle Book live action remake. She's ironically maybe my biggest issue with that film. From a casting perspective anyway, she's the one that stands out to me as being the most miscast.
Yeah, well, I think that was just the wrong character for her vocal type and what she was going for.
That's what I mean.
I don't think that's a bad. I think in a way it's a different type of vocal performance when compared to Alita here, but high level similar issues, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So I don't know. It's interesting. I do much prefer her here to that though, to the Jungle Book. But I mean, but I do agree it's one of the least compelling performances here. I think she's fine. I think I can land at. I think she's fine.
The one I was most worried about was Keegan Michael Key, and he ended up being kind of a highlight here.
It was a little grating at first, and then you have the AA-tron joke that's like, okay, maybe that is a little on the nose, but I was willing to live with it.
Yeah.
He does have a lot of great moments here, especially in the back half of the film. He's very entertaining and very, very good. I agree. I think on the whole, Keegan-Michael Key is a welcomed vocal performance here. And then Brian Tyree Henry, I mean, he's just straight up incredible here. He's very
he's really good. Chris Hemsworth is surprisingly good, despite having really big shoes to fill. I think he actually does a good job, once again, with all these other performances, blending into his character here. And actually, at times, I was forgetting it was even Chris Hemsworth.
I think he does a great. Yeah, it's a little noticeable at first, but that's perhaps because Optimus, as we see him at the beginning of the film, is not. I mean, it's clearly playing with those Optimus tropes, right? So he's not the wise and commanding leader we know him to be. So perhaps that's why Hemsworth is a little bit more noticeable. But he, and I guess to keep coming back to this, he does transform a little bit into Peter Cullen by the end, where he does have that booming quality and that
I think that's
Optimus way of articulating his leadership and the way he's able to bring morale and gather the troops. It's very Peter Cullen-like by the end.
You definitely hear a sense of growth in both Chris Hemsworth and Brian Tyree Henry's respective performances in a way that you can almost call this a coming-of-age film in a weird way. Like their dynamic is, it almost feels like two teenagers in a way. Yeah. And I think it's meant to. I think that is ultimately the point. But it does kind of have a coming-of-age like element that makes it more relatable, I think. And that's why I think kids will ultimately gravitate towards it.
Well, and again, going back to the, perplexing, and I say that in a good way, the unexpected nuances of this film, I just did not anticipate. I was really looking forward to the film. I didn't anticipate it would be as rich as it is. But Brian Tyree Henry approaches this film as if it's a Shakespearean tragedy. That's how he's voicing this character. It's like D16 is someone who cannot deal with the burden of feeling betrayed by these, how he reveres them as these Cybertron
as his heroes, essentially,
as his heroes, and therefore succumbs to his emotional unrest. And
becomes the very thing he claims to be fighting against. Exactly, the irony 100%. Of that. Yeah.
And so it's like he walked into this going, I'm going to play this as if it's a Shakespeare play. That's how it felt to me. And I think it gives the character just so much more weight that I loved. But those early scenes before the tragedy aspect of it comes into play, when it's just him and Hemsworth and they get to be playful and be friends, I mean, it's as charming as it gets.
It's good.
Those two,
it's good.
It's incredible. Yeah. Like you really feel that friendship between the two of them. It's animated in a great way as well, but like coupled with the vocal performances, you really do get a sense of how deeply bonded those two are. So as that relationship falls apart by the end, it's surprisingly heartbreaking.
This is the 2024 is going to be the year of surprisingly great prequels, isn't it?
It might be.
Yeah, because you have this, you had The First Omen earlier this year. I guess Furiosa, technically, prequel to Mad Max Fury Road.
True. That's a great point. It is the year of the prequels.
Am I missing anything? I feel like there may be another one. I have to look at my 2024 list and see.
I have to go through them, but
I know there's definitely those three. Point. There's definitely those three. And they're actually giving prequels a good name for once.
Absolutely. I completely agree. That is a great point. My last final thought on this.
A Quiet Place Day One for many people.
Ah, yes. I loved that movie. That is a great point. There it is. We have our quad there.
We do.
So something you mentioned earlier in terms of the box office and how disappointing the opening weekend numbers are. I think where this could have elemental like legs is that it has an 88% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah.
Very high.
That's
Over
true.
120 reviews. It also has a 98% audience score.
Yeah.
Which
Audiences are digging it.
suggests to me that there is going to be word of mouth for this film.
That's true. That's true. Because I think Elemental
And
had a similar disparity between critics and audiences.
thing.
Yeah.
So I'm really hoping that despite the low initial numbers, that if they maintain the film in theaters, that over time it could end up doing very well. I'm
Yeah.
hoping that is the case because
I think it could.
the
That's a good
review
point.
and audience scores are really high, way higher than I think a lot of us anticipated.
Mhm.
So
Mhm. Oh, it's the movie's way better than I think many of us anticipated, and hopefully that is the thing that ends up marketing the film long term as opposed to what it was doing short term.
I agree.
It's a good movie.
This
Good
is-
movie.
yeah,
I
it's
think
really
I think
good.
of the theatrical Transformers films we've gotten in total, including the Bayformers, I still have a soft spot for Dark of the Moon, but this is easily a close second in that regard.
Yeah, I love Dark of the Moon as well. This is very much up there. It's the best animated film of this year so far that I've seen. Certainly have others.
There's more
catch
to
up
there's
with.
more to come, and there's more that we know are coming that already have high scores from critics who have seen them already in the festival circuit. But I mean, I definitely preferred this over. I mean, I'm not to knock Inside Out too. I do like that movie, but I
I
definitely
really
take.
like it too.
I like this. We mentioned Josh Cooley. I'll take this over his other directorial effort, Toy Story 4.
Oh, I agree. This
Yeah.
is way better than Toy Story 4. Not even close.
Yeah, I think so too.
Not even
I
close.
think. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. My only pushback would be, and I don't know how to classify this film. I don't think you've seen it yet. It doesn't come out until next month, but Netflix was kind enough to send me a screener for the documentary, The Remarkable Life of Ibelin.
Oh, I've heard
And
amazing things about
It's
that.
incredible. I don't want to reveal too much, but I'll just say there's an animated component to the film. So I don't know how you classify it because it's documentary in a live action setting. It's
Yeah, that's a
part
good
animated. I don't
is-
know how to classify it, honestly.
Is it kind of similar in a way of, let's say, something like Kurt Cobain montage of Heck? That is like it's
Yeah.
animation, but it is still in a documentary like backdrop. It kind of almost exists in both spectrums.
Yes, I think there's more live action. I'd have to go back to revisit that film, but if memory serves, I think there's more of a live action element to this film
Okay.
that makes it tricky. Once you see it, I'm sure we'll be able to talk about it, but that would be the
Yeah, I look forward to
only
it.
exception for me. If that documentary qualifies as animated, like in the animated category, I would slightly take that over Transformers 1.
Okay.
Because I think it's just one of the best films I've seen of the year, period. But
Sure.
I honestly don't know how to classify it outside of documentary. It's obviously a documentary. It's there, and that will absolutely be a nominee.
Now
for me at the
I'm
end of the
trying to
year,
think of
regardless.
examples because we've seen documentaries that fall into that category of animation, like the film Tower.
Yeah.
Remember that from 2016?
Tower, but that's fully animated, or something like Flea, also
Flea,
fully animated.
Waltz with Bashir, is that also?
This-
I guess
I
that's
would
also,
say it's closer to Marcel the Shell with Shoes On.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's
Okay.
closer to that. Now, again, that's not a fair comparison because that's animated inserted into live action.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in terms of how it uses both, I'd say it's it's
Gotcha.
because
Okay.
it's not fully animated like
It's
those
not.
other
It's not this. It's not
documentaries.
the same type of fusion happening simultaneously.
Yeah. So
Gotcha.
at any rate, that's
Okay.
a rabbit hole that we'll get into at a later time. But I just point that out to say that if it qualifies, that's my favorite animated film of the year so far.
Gotcha. Okay.
If not, then it's Transformers 1. Yeah, I agree with you for sure.
All right.
And,
Good
and
movie.
as far, we talked about this a few weeks ago. As far as animation goes, does Disney get shut out this year? Pixar will get in.
They
we'll
have
see
no
with
choice but to
Moana
get
2.
Yeah.
We'll see, and I don't know how the Academy will lean as far as Transformers 1 goes, but I'm with you. It as of now, it is the best animated film of the year.
Yeah,
And then we got the Wild Robot this weekend, of course.
Yeah.
And then there's I think 2 more at least that we're getting Moana 2, and then the Lord of the Rings one. And which one am I missing? There's another one I believe.
Oh, the new Adam Elliott film.
Yes, I knew there was
Memoir of a
another one.
Snail. Yeah.
That's it. That's the other one.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm so anxious. This is going to be an exciting category this year, I think.
I think so.
At any rate,
watch Moana 2 win like Best Picture at the Academy Awards or something like that.
I don't think. No, if it's even just half decent, it's going to get in because it's Disney.
I know.
It's just got to be half decent, and it probably will be.
It probably will be.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Transformers 1. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. Hit us up on Letterboxd. We would love to know your thoughts. With that, as we wind down here, just a note, episode 603. At this point, as we are recording this, I truly have no idea if this is coming out first or episode 603. Either way, be on the lookout for that. It'll be closely released to each other. So if that show comes out after this, be sure to be on the lookout for that or go listen if it's already been released. But that's going to be a fun show because we're talking about animated movies on that episode as well with the Wild Robot coming out this weekend. We're talking more animated films, non-Disney Pixar films, which Transformers 1 classifies as.
That does. You're not wrong.
It's all very aligned this week. So.
You are not wrong, my friend.
With all of that said, Brennan, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
I cannot wait to hear my my nephew's thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can't wait. You have to let me
did
know
Sam
how he
like
likes
it? Did
Sam
Sam
really liked it. Yeah, he loved it.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
That's what I expected.
Yeah, no, he was a big fan. He's very excited for the Wild Robot.
Oh, okay.
can't wait
So
to
his
take him to that
tastes
too.
his tastes are wise. I like it.
Yep, he is. He's maturing right before my eyes.
Good man. Good man.
All right. Well, with all of that said, thanks everybody for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm proud of myself that I mostly nerded out over the craft of the film, the writing, and its surprisingly nuanced themes. And I did not get too crazy as far as Transformers lore goes. And I could have.
Yeah.
But
yeah, you could
I
have,
held
but
back.
you reined it in. You controlled yourself. You gave a good thought, which I appreciated.
You know, maybe I'll save that for another show. But yeah, there was plenty to geek out on. I'll just say that. Anyway, with all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh man, Optimus Prime and Megatron.
More than meets the eye, my friend.